around us, that we matter in some way. When we feel that our opinions are slighted, when others do not recognize our worth, we feel angry about this. And this need for recognition, which is part of this passion of amour propre, is for Rousseau also a cornerstone of justice. But it is also, as he says, at the same time, the demand for recognition can easily become cruel and violent as we demand this from others. Consider, again, just the following. I want to read one other passage from the same part of the text. He writes, as soon as men had begun mutually to value one another, and the idea of esteem was formed in their minds, each one claimed to have a right to it. Each one claimed to have a right to esteem or recognition. And it was no longer possible, he writes, for anyone to be lacking it with impunity. From this came the first duties of civility, even among savages. And from this, every voluntary wrong became an outrage. Every time someone was harmed or injured, it became an outrage, because along with the harm that resulted from the injury, he says, the offended party saw in it contempt for his person, which often was more insufferable than the harm itself. Think about the psychology, the moral psychology that Rousseau is invoking here in his talk about harm and injury. It's not the physical aspect of the harm that bothers him. It is the sort of contempt that is implied or entailed in the act of injury. Hence, he goes on to say, each man punished the contempt shown him in a manner proportionate to the esteem in which he held himself. Acts of revenge became terrible, and men became bloodthirsty and cruel. It is to say, amour propre and society gave rise to the state of war. Does this sound familiar? I think it should. I was trying to think of some example that might fit this, and one I came up with when I was thinking about this earlier. Consider a story that was much in the news. I forget if it was last spring or last summer sometime. The Danish cartoon controversy. You remember that, about the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, and that outrage and that protests, often violent, that occurred about that. To some degree, Rousseau might argue, the protests were about disrespectful cartoons of the Prophet. But he would argue, I suspect, that the deeper cause seemed to be that the protesters believed was disrespect being shown to them, to their beliefs, to what it is they held sacred in some sense. It is their beliefs that were being disrespected and were the cause of the protests. Amour propre, as Rousseau, I think, himself recognizes, is this very volatile passion. It contains the desire to be respected again and acknowledged, that is at the root of justice and virtue, and yet at the same time this passion, as we know, is easily manipulable by those who wish to convince others that their basic entitlements and are not being, or views are not being respected. To some degree, I think Rousseau would believe the protesters over those cartoons had a point. Their views were not being respected, and to which you might say a Lockean or a liberal formulation of the problem response would be, well, so what? The task of government, according to Locke, or the liberal view, is to ensure the security of person and property, to protect you from harm, and of course to provide you the freedom to practice what religion you like, consistent with the freedom of others to do so too. It is not the business of government to ensure that your beliefs are being respected. This was clearly the view, for example, of the Danish newspaper editors that published the cartoon, as well as the Danish Prime Minister, who refused to apologize for this on the ground, again, that the government's job is not to impose a gag order on what can and cannot be said on the grounds that some people might find it offensive. This is a respectable sort of liberal line of thought going from Locke to John Stuart Mill. And yet, while I am inclined to agree very much with that point of view, there is something powerful and true about what Rousseau has to say about it, about this kind of issue. Lockean liberal thought was addressed in many ways to people who had experienced the crucible of civil war, a century of religious conflict, and were looking for a way to settle their religious and political differences. Toleration, in many ways, is a liberal virtue because it requires us to distinguish between beliefs that we may take with the utmost seriousness in private life and yet nevertheless bracket them in some way once we enter the public world. This, in many ways, is the peculiar liberal virtue of self-restraint or self-denial, that we refuse to allow our own moral point of view to, in many ways, dominate in the public space. But it is one thing, you might say, to tolerate other views, and another thing to accord them respect and esteem. That seems to be something very different from what Locke talked about. To tolerate means not to persecute, simply means not to persecute, to leave alone, while respect for something requires that we esteem it. You might ask yourself, must we esteem and respect values and points of view that we do not share? This seems very different, again, from the sort of liberal understanding of toleration that means only extending acceptance to views, again, that are very different from our own. It doesn't require us to, as it were, censor, self-censor our own views on the ground that they may be, our views may be in some ways disrespectful or hurtful to others. This is a vast topic. I've sort of used the opportunity to sort of move away from Rousseau a little bit. But his point is, I think, that amour propre, the desire to be esteemed, recognized, and to have your values and points of view esteemed by those around you, is in fact a violent and uncontrollable passion. It is the passion very much like Plato's thumos, spiritedness, back in the Republic. It is a passion that makes us burn with anger over perceived slights, and makes us also risk our lives and endanger the lives of others to rectify what we believe to be acts of injustice. Like Plato, in many ways, Rousseau wants to know whether amour propre is purely a negative passion or disposition, or whether, like thumos, whether it can be redirected in some way to achieve social goods and social benefits. All of this is entailed in that short discussion of amour propre in the second discourse. So much of Rousseau's subsequent account of civilization and its discontents grows out of this peculiar psychological disposition and passion. So let's talk a little bit more about civilization and its discontents. In Woody Allen's movie Annie Hall, you might recall a scene where he says there are two kinds of people. They're the horrible and the miserable. The horrible are those who have suffered some kind of personal tragedy, a disfigurement of some kind, who are facing a terminal illness. The miserable is everybody else. Rousseau wants us to be miserable. He wants us to feel just how bad things are, how bad we are, how bad off we are. The only exception to this general human misery is, as he tells us at one point, kind of early primitive society. These societies described by him, not quite the state of nature, to be sure, maintained a kind of middling position between the pure state of nature and the development of modern conditions. He says these were the happiest and most durable societies and the best for man. It was primitive man, not the pure savage of the state of nature, where Rousseau finds a happy equilibrium between our powers and our needs that he says is the recipe for happiness, bringing our powers and our needs into equilibrium. But the end of that happy state came with two inventions, two discoveries: agriculture and metallurgy. Bless you. With agriculture came, here we see the division of land, the division of property, and the subsequent inequalities that came with it. With metallurgy came the art of war and conquest. With these two developments, he tells us, humanity entered a new stage, one where laws and political institutions became necessary to adjudicate conflicts over rights. And the establishment of governments that this entailed, rather than bringing peace, as it would for Hobbes or Locke, the establishment of governments had the effect simply of sanctioning the existing inequalities that had begun to develop. For Rousseau, there is something deeply shocking and deeply troubling about the assertion that men who were once free and equal are so easily, as it were, led to consent to the inequalities of property and to rule by the stronger, which government brings into being. The social contract, as he presents it in the second discourse, is really a kind of swindle. The establishment of government is a kind of swindle that the rich and the powerful use to control the poor and the dispossessed. Again, rather than instituting justice, this compact merely